For weeks, people following this case have been asking the same question. Why has almost everyone close to Nolan stayed so quiet? That question became even louder after investigators confirmed they were continuing to collect digital evidence, while the FBI released another public statement reminding people that even the smallest piece of information could matter. Then came something few expected. One of Nolan's friends finally spoke publicly. Around the same time, discussion began growing around an audio recording that many viewers believe raises new questions rather than providing clear answers. Does it solve the case? No, but it has certainly changed what people are talking about. Today we're going to walk through what has actually happened, what has been officially confirmed, what remains uncertain, and why investigators appear to believe that every conversation, no matter how ordinary it sounds, deserves another look. Because sometimes it's not the loudest piece of evidence that matters. Sometimes it's the one people almost ignored. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie has now stretched over months, and every passing week has brought another wave of speculation online. Family members have continued searching for answers. Law enforcement agencies have repeatedly said that the investigation remains active. Search warrants have been executed, electronic devices examined, interviews conducted, and evidence reviewed. Yet despite all of that work, many of the biggest questions remain unanswered. Investigators have consistently urged the public not to confuse online theories with verified facts. That's an important distinction, because social media has produced thousands of claims, some based on official documents, others built almost entirely on assumption. The challenge for anyone trying to understand this investigation is separating those two things. That's where today's developments become important. The FBI's latest public communication did not announce an arrest or reveal a dramatic breakthrough. Instead, officials once again encouraged anyone with information to come forward, emphasizing that evidence often becomes meaningful only after investigators compare it with other pieces already collected. That may sound routine, but experienced investigators often repeat those requests for a reason. Cases involving digital evidence rarely move in a straight line. A text message may not seem important until months later. A phone call might appear ordinary until another witness confirms where someone actually was. An old conversation can suddenly carry new significance after forensic examinations are completed. That's why investigators frequently return to earlier interviews. What sounded unimportant in the beginning sometimes becomes central later. Meanwhile, public attention shifted towards someone who had remained largely out of the spotlight. One of Nolan's friends reportedly decided to speak publicly after weeks of intense speculation online. People immediately wanted to know why now. Was there pressure? Did investigators ask for help? Or had watching rumors spread simply reached a point where remaining silent no longer felt possible? Those questions don't yet have complete answers. What is known is that the public response was immediate. Within hours, discussion forums were analyzing every sentence, every pause, and every word choice. Some viewers believed the statements sounded sincere. Others argued they created additional questions instead of resolving existing ones. That reaction isn't unusual. When people connected to a major investigation finally speak, every phrase tends to receive extraordinary attention. Sometimes more attention than it deserves. Investigators generally focus less on how someone sounds and far more on whether their account matches independently verified evidence. That distinction often gets lost online. Voice inflection isn't evidence. Timeline consistency can be. Phone records can be. Location data can be. Security footage can be. Witness statements that independently support each other can be. Those are the kinds of details investigators typically spend months examining. The growing discussion surrounding the audio recording follows that same pattern. Many people have described it as the recording that changes everything. That's a dramatic description. Whether it truly changes anything depends entirely on what investigators can verify. Audio evidence often presents unique challenges. Recordings may be incomplete. Background sounds can be misunderstood. Conversations can be taken out of context. Even authentic recordings require investigators to determine exactly when they were made, who was present, whether edits occurred, and how they fit into the broader timeline. Those aren't questions the public can answer simply by listening. Investigators use specialized forensic techniques to examine recordings frame by frame, measuring inconsistencies that aren't obvious to the human ear. If a recording becomes part of an active investigation, experts may compare voices, background noises, device characteristics, and metadata before drawing conclusions. That's one reason law enforcement rarely rushes to comment on audio circulating online. Verification comes first. Public interpretation comes later. That brings us back to the timeline. When Nancy disappeared, investigators immediately began building a minute-by-minute picture of her last known movements. Every confirmed sighting mattered. Every phone call mattered. Every message mattered. Family members, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances became part of that effort. Detectives frequently describe these investigations as assembling an enormous puzzle without knowing how many pieces exist. Some pieces fit immediately. Others remain isolated for months. Some eventually prove unrelated altogether. The public often sees only a small portion of that process. Searches occur. News conferences are held. Statements are released. Behind the scenes, however, investigators may be reviewing thousands of pages of records, surveillance footage from multiple locations, financial transactions, electronic communications, and witness interviews. That work rarely produces instant answers. Instead, progress often comes through accumulation. One verified fact leads to another, then another. Eventually, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Whether investigators have reached that stage remains unclear. Officials have continued emphasizing that the investigation remains active. That wording matters. It tells the public that evidence continues to be evaluated rather than suggesting the case has gone cold. For Nancy's family, every update brings renewed attention, but not necessarily renewed certainty. Imagine waiting day after day while strangers debate your loved one's disappearance online. Every headline offers hope. Every rumor creates another emotional swing. It's a reality many families and missing person investigations describe as exhausting. They want answers. Instead, they often receive questions. As public interest has grown, so has scrutiny of people connected to the investigation. Friends have been examined. Acquaintances have been discussed. Past relationships have been revisited. Old photographs have resurfaced. Social media posts from months or even years earlier have suddenly become topics of debate. Some of those discussions are based on verified information. Others are built almost entirely on speculation. That's why investigators repeatedly caution against assuming guilt based solely on online conversation. Public attention can sometimes help generate tips. It can also produce misinformation that investigators must spend valuable time sorting through. According to law enforcement officials in many major investigations, one false rumor can trigger hundreds of unnecessary phone calls, distracting resources from more credible leads. That's one reason official statements are often measured and brief. Investigators generally release only information they believe serves a specific purpose. Everything else may remain confidential, while the investigation continues. The friend who recently spoke publicly now finds himself in an unusual position. Supporters praise him for speaking. Critics question why it took so long. Others believe his comments neither help nor hurt the investigation. Without knowing everything investigators already possess, it's impossible to determine how significant those remarks may ultimately become. What sounds important publicly may already have been known privately for months. Likewise, something that appears completely ordinary to viewers could become meaningful after investigators compare it with evidence the public has never seen. That's the part many people forget. Law enforcement almost always knows more than it can publicly discuss, sometimes much more. And that brings us back to the newest FBI statement. Although it didn't reveal dramatic new evidence, it reinforced something investigators have repeated throughout this case. They are still asking people to come forward with information, no matter how small it may seem. History has shown why those requests matter. In many long-running investigations, a witness eventually remembers an overlooked conversation. Someone discovers an old photograph. A receipt turns up in a forgotten drawer. A neighbor recalls seeing an unfamiliar vehicle. Individually, those details may appear insignificant. Together, they can reshape an entire timeline. Whether that happens here remains to be seen. For now, investigators continue reviewing evidence while the public continues searching for answers. The newly discussed audio has added another layer to an already complicated investigation. The friend's decision to speak has introduced new perspectives while leaving several important questions unresolved. And despite months of searching, interviews, forensic work, and public attention, one central mystery remains exactly where it has been from the beginning. What really happened to Nancy? That question continues to drive every interview, every forensic review, and every appeal for information. And the next development may depend on evidence the public hasn't even heard about yet. At first, that seemed straightforward. A friend had spoken publicly. An audio recording was drawing attention. The FBI had reminded the public that the investigation was still active. Many people assumed the next step would be immediate clarity. Instead, the situation became more complicated. The more closely people examined the timeline, the more they realized there were still significant gaps. Investigators have never suggested that every question has been answered. In fact, their public statements have continued to emphasize patience while evidence is analyzed. That wording has remained remarkably consistent throughout the investigation. To some observers, consistency sounds repetitive. To investigators, it often means the work isn't finished. One experienced detective once explained that major investigations usually have two timelines. There's the public timeline, the one everyone sees through news reports and press conferences. Then, there's the investigative timeline. That's the version built from interviews, digital records, surveillance footage, laboratory testing, and evidence that may never become public unless charges are filed. The public rarely gets to see that second timeline in real time. That helps explain why speculation often fills the empty spaces. The newly discussed audio became one of those empty spaces. Almost immediately after it began circulating, people started drawing conclusions from it. Some believed the voices sounded calm. Others thought they detected nervousness. Some claimed certain words carried hidden meaning. But investigators generally approach recordings differently. Instead of asking how something sounds emotionally, they ask whether it can be independently verified. Who created the recording? When was it made? Has it been edited? Can the background noises identify a location? Do other witnesses confirm the conversation? Those questions matter far more than public opinion. Digital forensic specialists frequently examine recordings frame by frame. Even tiny interruptions in sound waves can reveal whether a file has been altered. Background noises that seem insignificant, a passing train, a barking dog, church bells, traffic patterns, can sometimes help establish time or location. In some investigations, experts have identified vehicles simply by analyzing engine sounds captured in the distance. That's why audio evidence often takes much longer to evaluate than many people expect. The process is methodical, and methodical rarely looks dramatic. That would have been the end of it. But another detail stood out. As reporters continued covering the investigation, attention shifted back to Nolan's circle of friends. Not because investigators accused anyone publicly, rather because people naturally wondered what those closest to the situation had seen or heard during those critical early days. Friends often become some of the most important witnesses in any investigation. They know routines, they recognize unusual behavior, they remember conversations that outsiders would never hear. Sometimes they don't realize the importance of those conversations until weeks later. Memory works that way. A seemingly ordinary exchange can suddenly feel very different once new information comes to light. That's one reason investigators frequently conduct follow-up interviews. The goal isn't necessarily to catch someone contradicting themselves. Instead, it's to refresh memories after additional evidence has been collected. A witness who couldn't remember a specific date during the first interview might remember it later after seeing a calendar, reviewing text messages, or learning about another confirmed event. Investigations often advance through those small corrections. Not dramatic confessions, not movie-style interrogations. Just ordinary people remembering one more detail. Records show that law enforcement agencies involved in complex investigations routinely compare those interviews with digital evidence. If someone recalls being at a certain location, investigators may compare that statement with available surveillance footage. If someone remembers making a phone call, they may compare it with phone records. If someone recalls driving somewhere, license plate readers or traffic cameras may help verify that movement. Each piece either strengthens the timeline or raises additional questions. That brings us to another aspect of this case that has continued attracting attention: digital communication. Modern investigations leave investigators with far more information than detectives had 30 or 40 years ago. Text messages, call logs, location services, photographs, fitness trackers, vehicle navigation systems, cloud backups. Every one of those technologies can potentially provide useful information. They can also create confusion. Location services aren't always perfectly accurate. Messages can be deleted. Phones can be left behind. Accounts may synchronize across multiple devices. Investigators have to determine not only what the records show, but also whether those records accurately represent what actually happened. That's painstaking work, and it doesn't happen overnight. Meanwhile, Nancy's family has continued living through the uncertainty that accompanies every new development. Every headline creates hope. Every correction brings disappointment. Family members in long-running investigations often describe the emotional toll as a cycle that never completely stops. One day, someone reports a promising lead. The next day, investigators determine it isn't connected. Hope rises, then falls again. It's difficult for anyone outside that experience to fully appreciate. As public interest continued growing, internet discussions became increasingly divided. Some people believed investigators already knew exactly what had happened, but lacked enough evidence to move forward. Others argued the investigation remained wide open. The truth is that law enforcement has not publicly confirmed either conclusion. Officials have remained careful with their language. That's significant. Experienced investigators generally avoid making statements they cannot later support with evidence presented in court. Silence doesn't necessarily indicate uncertainty. Sometimes it reflects discipline. Then something unexpected happened. Attention turned once again to the FBI's latest public appeal. Many viewers focused on one particular aspect. Officials weren't simply asking for witnesses who had never spoken before. They also encouraged people who believed they had already provided information to contact investigators again, if they remembered anything new. That request may seem ordinary. In reality, it's often extremely important. Human memory changes over time. A receipt found months later can trigger forgotten memories. A family photograph may reveal someone standing in the background. A conversation recalled after hearing another witness speak can suddenly become meaningful. Investigators understand that. That's why they continue asking. The public sometimes assumes that tips stop arriving after the first few weeks. In many investigations, that's not true. Significant information has surfaced months and even years later. Sometimes because someone finally felt comfortable speaking. Sometimes because circumstances changed. Sometimes because a detail that once seemed irrelevant suddenly became important. The friend who recently broke his silence now finds himself at the center of that discussion. Did he provide investigators with information they already knew? Did his public comments encourage additional witnesses to come forward, or will they ultimately prove unrelated to the investigation's central questions? At this stage, those answers remain unknown. But history suggests something interesting. In many major investigations, public statements don't become valuable because they solve the mystery themselves. They become valuable because they prompt someone else to remember something. A neighbor, a coworker, a cashier, someone who initially believed their memory wasn't important. That's often how investigations gain momentum after months of uncertainty. One memory leads to another. One interview points toward another witness. One verified fact strengthens another. Slowly, the timeline becomes more complete. Still, important contradictions remain unresolved. Some public accounts appear difficult to reconcile with others. Certain reported timelines have fueled ongoing discussion online. Yet investigators have not publicly confirmed that those apparent inconsistencies represent deception. There are many reasons memories differ: stress, confusion, poor recollection, simple mistakes. Investigators must separate ordinary human error from evidence that genuinely suggests something more significant. That's a careful distinction, and one that cannot be rushed. As investigators continue reviewing digital evidence alongside witness interviews, they are almost certainly looking for consistency. Not perfection, consistency. Do independent sources point toward the same sequence of events? Do electronic records support witness recollections? Does physical evidence align with the established timeline? Those questions guide investigations far more than online speculation ever could. For Nancy's loved ones, however, none of those technical processes erase the uncertainty. Every morning begins with the same unanswered question. Every evening ends the same way. Until investigators can establish exactly what happened, that uncertainty remains. The latest FBI statement, the friend's public comments, and the growing discussion surrounding the audio have all added new pieces to the public conversation. Whether any of them become decisive pieces of evidence is something only the investigation can determine. But there is one aspect of this case that continues standing out. Investigators have never stopped asking for information. That persistence suggests they still believe someone, somewhere, may know something that hasn't yet reached the people working the case. And if history is any guide, it is often the smallest overlooked detail, not the most dramatic headline, that eventually brings investigators one step closer to the truth. The question now is whether that overlooked detail has already surfaced, or whether it's still waiting to be discovered. That brings us to where the investigation stands today. Months have passed since Nancy Guthrie was last seen, yet investigators continue to describe the case as active. Search efforts have been carried out, digital evidence has been examined, witnesses have been interviewed, and, according to public statements, authorities continue to evaluate new information as it comes in. For many people following the story, that's encouraging. An active investigation means the work hasn't stopped. It also means that not everything investigators know is necessarily being shared with the public. That's common in cases like this. Law enforcement agencies often hold back certain details for practical reasons. Sometimes it's to protect the integrity of witness interviews. Sometimes it's to prevent false confessions. Other times it's because releasing specific information could interfere with future investigative steps. That can be frustrating for the public. People naturally want immediate answers. Families want them even more, but experienced investigators have long said that patience is often one of the most difficult and most necessary parts of solving a complicated case. Looking back over everything we've covered, a pattern begins to emerge. The FBI's latest statement didn't promise a breakthrough. Instead, it reinforced a message that has remained consistent throughout the investigation. If you know something, report it. The friend who finally chose to speak publicly didn't close the book on the case. Instead, the comments added another perspective for investigators and the public to consider. And the audio recording that has generated so much discussion has become another piece of information being examined, not a final answer. Those developments may seem modest when viewed individually. Together, however, they tell us something important. The investigation is still moving, perhaps not in dramatic leaps, but step by step, one verified detail at a time. History gives us plenty of reasons not to underestimate that process. There have been countless investigations where answers didn't emerge during the first few weeks, or even the first few months. Instead, they came after investigators revisited old evidence with fresh eyes. A witness remembered an overlooked conversation. Technology advanced enough to recover deleted information. A previously unknown photograph surfaced. Someone who had remained silent finally decided it was time to talk. Cases have turned on moments exactly like those. That doesn't mean the same thing will happen here. No one can honestly promise that, but it explains why investigators continue encouraging the public to come forward. They know experience has taught them one simple lesson. The next important lead rarely announces itself in advance. It often arrives looking completely ordinary. Another important point is worth remembering. Public interest has helped keep Nancy's case in the national conversation. That attention can be valuable. Media coverage often reminds potential witnesses that investigators are still seeking information. Families of missing persons frequently express gratitude when people continue talking about their loved one because it keeps the search from fading into the background. At the same time, public attention carries responsibility. Rumors can spread quickly. Edited clips can circulate without context. Old photographs can be presented as new. Anonymous social media posts can take on a life of their own despite having no verified source. Investigators understand this challenge. That's why they repeatedly encourage people to rely on official updates rather than speculation. It's also why journalists covering ongoing investigations typically distinguish between confirmed facts and unverified claims. That distinction matters, especially in a case where emotions understandably run high. For Nancy's family, every headline represents something deeply personal. Behind every news report is a mother, a daughter, a relative, a friend, someone whose absence is felt every single day. It's easy to become focused on timelines, phone records, interviews, and evidence. But those pieces exist because they may eventually answer one deeply human question. What happened? Everything investigators do ultimately leads back to that. As for Nolan's friend, only time will reveal how significant those public comments ultimately become. Perhaps investigators had already heard every detail in private. Perhaps the interview prompted additional witnesses to contact authorities. Or perhaps it simply helped clarify information already being examined. At this stage, law enforcement has not publicly said. The same is true of the audio recording. Many online discussions have described it in dramatic terms. But experienced investigators rarely rely on dramatic descriptions. They rely on verification. Until experts determine exactly what the recording represents, how it was created, and how it fits into the established timeline, it remains one piece of a much larger puzzle. And that's an important reminder for anyone following this story. Real investigations usually don't unfold like television dramas. They involve paperwork, laboratory analysis, long interviews, hours spent reviewing surveillance footage, careful comparisons of electronic records, follow-up conversations, more waiting, then more reviewing. Progress often comes quietly. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with another confirmed fact added to the timeline. As this investigation continues, there are still questions that remain unanswered. Will additional witnesses come forward? Will new forensic analysis reveal something investigators couldn't previously detect? Will another digital record help clarify a key moment in the timeline? Those are questions no one outside the investigative team can answer today. What we do know is that authorities have not indicated the search for answers is over. That alone is significant. It means the door remains open for new information. And sometimes, that's exactly what changes the direction of an investigation. If you've followed missing person cases over the years, you've probably seen this before. A case appears quiet for weeks. Then one verified tip leads investigators somewhere unexpected. A routine interview uncovers a forgotten detail. An old piece of evidence is re-examined using newer technology. Months of uncertainty suddenly begin to make more sense. No two investigations are identical, but those moments happen often enough that experienced investigators never stop looking. For Nancy's family, that persistence matters. For the investigators working the case, it remains part of their responsibility. And for everyone watching from home, it serves as a reminder that there is a difference between waiting and standing still. This investigation may appear quiet from the outside. That doesn't necessarily mean nothing is happening behind the scenes. Before we close, it's worth returning to the question we asked at the very beginning. Why did Nolan's friend choose to speak now? At this point, only that individual knows the complete answer. Whether the decision was motivated by public attention, a desire to correct rumors, or simply the belief that it was time to be heard has not been officially explained. What matters now is not public opinion. It's whether investigators can verify the information and determine how it fits into everything else they already know. That's the standard every piece of evidence must meet. Not whether it's dramatic, not whether it goes viral online, but whether it helps establish the truth. As this story continues to develop, we'll keep following confirmed updates, official statements, and verified reporting while separating established facts from speculation. Because in investigations like this, accuracy matters just as much as urgency. If new information is released by investigators, we'll be here to break it down carefully and place it into the broader timeline so you can understand not just what's new, but why it matters. Until then, one question continues to hang over this entire case. Somewhere, someone may still hold the missing piece that investigators have been searching for all along. If you've been following Nancy's case from the beginning, let us know in the comments what verified development has stood out to you the most. As always, please keep the discussion respectful toward Nancy's family and avoid presenting rumors as fact. If you found this timeline helpful and want straightforward updates as official information becomes available, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for spending part of your day with us, and we'll see you in the next investigation.